Hi, everyone. Please, our students, turn your video on. Thank you. I'm going to just let everyone slowly connect to audio and then we'll get started. Okay, so hello and welcome everybody to Young Prototypes lecture series number 4. Welcome to our guests, Molly Hunker and Kyle Miller, who are presenting their book, Building Practice. Laura will make a short introduction in a moment. But before that, for those of you who are new today, Young Prototypes is a lecture series, part of a graduate elective course at MSU this spring semester, spring 23. It's aimed to be a platform to explore the notion of experimental design research as an area of architectural production through the voice of emergent architectural practices. After the talk, there will be a discussion led by our students, the students in our elective, and moderated by Sadie Collins today, one of our students. So please feel free to participate through the chat, raising your hand, or just jumping in anytime during the discussion. As a reminder, we are recording these sessions for archiving purposes. We'll try to have them online as soon as possible so that you can also watch the recordings. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the word to Laura. So enjoy, everyone.
Hi, everyone. So today we are celebrating the first ever book presentation of Building Practice by Kyle Miller and Molly Hunker. We're so honored to be your pioneering audience, guys. The talk today is an essential one within the context of the seminar, and it performs as a kind of meta discourse on why we're all gathered here in this Zoom meeting. So Kyle and Molly's book can be cited among a genealogy of projects by architects attempting to understand other architects, namely the influences exerted on and by them. Brett Steele's first works and Rafael Moneo's Theoretical Anxiety are two such books that come to mind. And Building Practice attempts to act similarly as a kind of X-ray of the field, but goes further to provide a diagnosis on the issues which are at the forefront of our disciplinary anxieties today. Kyle is the associate dean of the School of Architecture at Syracuse, and the co-founder of Possible Mediums. His research has been recognized, awarded, and published almost everywhere, including the Graham Foundation, the McDowell Fellowship, the AIA, in Log, in the JAE, the list goes on. Molly is the principal co-captain of Sports, an award-winning practice with publicly oriented, culturally impactful work all over the US. She's also assistant professor at Syracuse, and I would say a co-captain of that ship as well in many respects. We'd like our students to identify today a kind of through line via your research to the issues which their own generation will confront when they graduate next year. So without further ado, I will pass on the mic to you guys, Kyle and Molly.
Okay, thank you for having us. As has been said, this is our first time presenting the book, and we're trying to give a kind of succinct depiction of different aspects of the book. And we will offer up a provocation for each of the 12 short texts that Molly and I authored. One of us is very prepared for this presentation. The other one is going to wing it. We're going to see how it goes, but we're excited to share this information with you guys.
So essentially, the project of Building Practice brings together a bunch of interviews of 32 different young practitioners and people trained in architecture, but some doing other things. So curators, fabricators, strategists, critics, activists, designers, educators, etc. in trying to understand strategies for linking practical and theoretical forms of knowledge in architecture.
The book organization is in 3 parts. So there's an introduction that has been shared with Pablo and Laura's students that we hope you've read as a means of kind of contextualizing all of the practices that are profiled in the book. The 12 short texts that I mentioned earlier follow the introduction, and then the 32 interviews are the bulk of the book, and really have the ambition to provide an insight into how these different practices approach architecture.
And to what Laura said also, I think in terms of you guys, about to go into the profession, this is really trying to understand different strategies for that through all of these different interviews. So what this kind of first act of this emerging generation of practices identifies as the kind of the most important things right now of building a practice today in architecture.
So this is a list of the offices that we interviewed. Molly and I were just talking now about one of our hopes for the book is that it allows our individual interviews to start to transfer into other offices and influence other offices. So these offices are oftentimes in close proximity to one another and in conversation. And I think our hope is that those interviews that were conducted individually become part of a collective conversation. So the first topic is that of academia. And you'll see on these slides, we offer a kind of provocation along with each of the 12 short texts. One of the things that we talked about in many of the interviews as a result of a lot of the people we interviewed also being educators was the entanglement of academia and practice. And as you'll see in the quotes that are on the next 2 slides, I think there's a kind of uncomfortable relationship sometimes between the roles that people must fill as an academic and as a practitioner. And we talked a lot in the interviews about the pros and cons of having a foot on either side of what is sometimes a very tangible divide. We talked about how being an academic affords one opportunities to test ideas in an academic environment through teaching without the kind of worry of budget constraints, schedules, client demands, etc. But on the other end of the spectrum, it also presents opportunities for academics to take a more casual approach to practice. And my assessment, at least, is that compared to counterparts in other countries, it produces a little bit less evidence of their efforts in the built environment, given that that practice happens more selectively as opposed to out of necessity, because architects in other countries might not have the same level of support from academic institutions that a lot of these practitioners have in the United States. And I think one of the things we tried to call out in the short text that we wrote about academia was how these architects are very conscious of the kind of level of comfort that might hinder their development through professional practice and through putting things in the built environment that really provide them with opportunities to test those ideas.
Okay, so clients. There's numerous reasons why a young architect today may not want to or be able to wait around for the perfect commission from a perfect client. Many new practices certainly don't. Design competitions, self-funded work, spec homes, grants, alternative funding models, and developer partnerships, among many other strategies, all play important roles in architecture's practices, their first projects. Emerging architects still design some single-family houses and small commercial projects, but it's more typical for them to be working on projects that redefine or rethink the meaning of client entirely. Communities, nonprofit organizations, and clients can be considered some of the most important and even today the most common clients that newly formed architecture firms seek out and connect with. Developing and maintaining relationships with clients takes work. How an architect communicates, how confident they are, and how knowledgeable they are all factor into the labor of client relations. Architects today, especially those who teach to support themselves in their professional endeavors, often feel strongly about working with clients whose social and political values align with their own. They may prioritize this above compensation as they determine whom to work for and with. That decision, however, also affects business growth and profitability. So the clients architects choose may not have a lot of capital to spare. At the same time, the architects who want to work on projects with these clients also care very deeply about paying their employees well, for example. So ultimately, what spans that gap? As practices move from research-oriented activities to operating as registered businesses, what is emerging is a complex convergence of socio-political values and strategic development. These intersections yield to calls by business strategists to create pipelines to manage future work or risk going under.
We talked a lot with the design offices about aesthetics, and when we're talking about aesthetics, we're really talking about the kind of principal underlying visual qualities of work, either produced by an individual architect, across a practice, or even across a generation. And I think more commonly in the past, the discipline of architecture evolved, I think, through a series of discrete aesthetic trajectories that architects often subscribed to or placed themselves in opposition to. And one of the things that we saw today when surveying the work of these practices is less anxiety, let's say, over how their aesthetic agenda puts them in alignment or misalignment with other offices, and also a kind of comfort with allowing an aesthetic agenda to be unique from project to project. And what that shows us is that there's oftentimes a kind of care with which a designer might approach a project and let other things influence the aesthetic agenda, which we see as much more emergent and maybe even reflective of the conditions in which a project is situated or a practice exists. And I think what we sought to do in the short text that we wrote is really capture that level of comfort and the lack of anxiety that I think many architects felt in the past.
So a half century ago, a building may have been able to be designed by one person, but today architecture is almost exclusively a team sport. Collaborations are necessary for a project to be attentive and responsive to its socio-political context, sensitive to its environment, sustainable in its construction and ongoing maintenance, accessible to diverse constituents, sometimes less expensive, and often more joyful, all qualities that many young architects are increasingly dedicated to pursuing. In the process of building an architecture practice today, architects in the US are facing a tedious licensure process, enormous financial pressure, growing oversight from various governing bodies, and a client base that may not recognize or value the role of an architect. So collaboration really offers a way forward. Increasingly, newly established offices are seeking out and nurturing unique partnerships between designer and client, architect and developer, curator and audience, designer and contractor, activist and community, business strategist and employees, et cetera, et cetera. Singular design visions and ideological agendas are not the driving forces in many of these collaborations. Regardless of their outputs, whether buildings, exhibition, podcasts, business relationships, et cetera, these collaborations focus more on the processes of exchange and interface among the voices and views of all contributors. Over time, these unique collaborations are likely to yield innovative strategies for architecture firms to establish and sustain themselves, creating new financial models, forms of cultural activity and community engagement, fabrication systems, and perhaps most importantly, inspiring and lasting contributions to the built environment. We're stuck.
No, it's cool. We talked a lot about context and whether or not the project is built or remains on paper or is even being developed within a design studio that a student is enrolled in, there is a context. And we've found that projects that embrace, let's say, acknowledge first of all, and then embrace that context are oftentimes more impactful and more meaningful. One way to think about this as a student is if you're developing a studio project, you're situated within the context of the discipline, and there's knowledge sets and references and narratives, scholarship that sits underneath all the things that your professors have been exposed to that inform their approach to design and ultimately are a place in which your work is situated, kind of knowingly or not. So I think one of the things that we see with these practices is a much more proactive approach to engaging with the context and letting the context inform the project. And there's been moments in the history of the discipline where context was thought of as an antagonist and a hindrance to, let's say, a vision being placed within a particular context. And so I think there's a kind of shared level of comfort and eagerness among younger architects today to not only embrace the context in which a project is situated, but allow it to really influence and shape the conceptual identity of a project. And oftentimes that requires a kind of critical interrogation of place. And so we see a lot more engagement with places in which architects operate within, and early on in a project as a means to ensure that that project is of its place and kind of conscious of the different circumstances that one might operate within.
The question of whom architects are talking to through their work becomes a critical one as an office develops and grows. Is communication with clients most important because it enables a project to get built? Or is the builder more important so that the project is executed with the highest possible level of craft and care? Or is it communication with the community so a project is most useful over the course of its life? Or are architects ultimately communicating with other architects, contributing new knowledge? It's ultimately how architects facilitate communication and how nimble architects are when communicating with all of these different people that facilitates growth in many facets of professional practice. When architects work in academia, they often feel a responsibility or are required to produce critical disciplinary knowledge. Yet few among an emerging generation of architects feel this is the most important responsibility they have related to communication today. Instead, most younger architects prioritize speaking to broader audiences. These architects are experimenting with representational types, methods for dialogue earlier in the process, and channels for dissemination that embrace and even leverage a more inclusive set of voices. They're talking to more people along the way to ensure that the project is economically, intellectually, and physically accessible to more people in the end. While an ambition to communicate more effectively with more people does seem to be common to many verbal and visual strategies today, the modest goal of a project being embraced by those who build it and use it is equally important and prioritized by many new architectural practices as a means of embracing stewardship of the built environment.
I think identity and communication kind of go hand in hand. And I think in part, it's because a lot of one's identity is formulated through the way one interacts and engages with social media, and therefore a very large public audience. One of the things we talked about with these designers and architects is how they go about either actively constructing that public persona, you could call it an act of branding, or leave that up to somebody else. And so in the two quotes that you'll see on these next two slides, you'll see two very different approaches. And I think just because of the significance of social media platforms, I think architects at least have to consider what their outward facing identity is. And ultimately that starts to bring them into alignment or misalignment with others that might share values or share different backgrounds or lived experiences. And ultimately that probably generates a kind of closeness through collaborators of a project that might allow their personal lives to become part of a project. One of the things that's just a matter of fact is the kind of decreasing separation between one's private life and one's public life. And so it's interesting to see how the kind of personalities of these people subconsciously affect our reception of their work. And I think because that's part of the equation, it's something that everyone has started to pay attention to.
So historically, architects kind of saw themselves as experts, but a perception of the architect as sole genius has long been out of date and has given way to many forms of collaboration and an acknowledgement or even celebration that expertise resides within the community in which an architect is working. So many new architecture firms feel a sense of responsibility to build relationships based in trust so that a project truly supports the community it serves and contributes to positive change. But these efforts raise important questions. How does one even define the community of a project? Is it the group of people who live in or near the space an architect is designing or intervening in? Is it the group of people most affected by the project, and affected in what sense? Is it the client? Does it include the individuals building the project, the labor that brings it to fruition? Does the architect belong to the community? Doing meaningful work that contributes to well-being seems to be a common goal for this generation of thinkers and designers. Many set out to work with specific groups of people or in particular locations. Individuals and spaces consistently denied good design, infrastructure, and investment. But how one works in and supports a community they're not a part of is a complex issue. Are they always an outsider? Will their well-meaning intentions be mistaken for exploitation or even lead to harm? Together, new frameworks for talking to people affected by a project in earlier phases, post-occupancy surveys and analysis, and active attempts to define collaboratively what success means may ultimately atomize the understanding of expertise.
Bear with me while I read a long list. Automation, black light, test sets, chewing gum, choreography, clip art, color blocking, computer science, economics, environmental justice, fashion, film, gabled roofs, garden parties, geometric primitives, grids, building types, marzipan, money, music, neurodiversity, ocean floors, off-the-shelf materials, optical illusions, other architects, painting, parades, planetary stars, photography, politics, infrastructure, weaving, and violence. This is a list of some of the things that we acknowledge that these architects are influenced by. And just like a kind of endlessly uncurated image feed, I think there's an endless uncurated list of influences that we're all subjected to just by the way that information is shared and consumed. And I think it further empowers architects to curate their own set of influences as a way of beginning to kind of shape the reception and identity of their projects. This is very different than how influence was kind of processed through gatekeeping in the past. And I think architects brought themselves into alignment with others by always making sure they made the same references to particular influences as a way to kind of convey a proximity to a particular conversation. I think today, because those influences are much more broad, they're also more personal, and I think allow for projects to also extend those personal interests of offices as opposed to becoming something that's really thought of as a generational project that's propped up by a shared set of influences. And so I think we also see just a lot of engagement with more familiar points of reference. This was a comment that Jennifer Bonner made in a previous slide that kind of already endear projects to a much broader audience.
With construction, many new practices today are kind of turning away from the high-tech and machine-driven and choosing off-the-shelf, local, or inexpensive materials and processes. Perhaps it's because many young architects today were trained by the digital avant-garde and witnessed their struggles or lack of desire to build their work, or that they want to start building things right out of school with no money, or they have no contractor connections. Perhaps it's the cost of custom fabrication and an acceptance that they lack certain skills. Whatever it is, this is a kind of thing that we're seeing going on with this generation. Their projects are built using conventional assembly systems with regular materials and typical details, but they are anything but conventional, regular, or typical. These architects acknowledge the environmental impact of material extraction and waste, the economic and socio-political impact of labor systems, the expertise and intelligence of craft, and the power in partnering with a builder. This recognition sponsors an approach to construction that looks very little like approaches developed by previous generations. What remains to be seen is whether and how the conceptual and experimental character of new architectural practices perseveres given the pressing environmental, economic, and social impacts of construction. Doing more with less is a design and construction strategy that not only responds to those larger issues, but also makes a positive impact on individuals involved in the project, including how a client lives their life or how a builder considers their craft. So to ensure continued positive change, the responsibility will fall on architects to prioritize sustainable design and construction, setting standards for everyone involved that consider the urgent need to offset the detrimental effects of the building industry on the built environment.
So for obvious reasons, we talked a lot about politics with these architects and the way in which they situate themselves politically while acting as an architect, let's say, versus just acting as a thoughtful and an engaged citizen. And one of the things that we discussed at length was now that a lot of these offices have an opportunity to really operate in a built environment and have their work make an impact on a lot of other people, is the responsibility they feel or they might not feel as kind of stewards of the built environment, and those that must make a positive contribution and be politically mindful and even savvy when it comes to materializing their ideas through construction. This is something that's not unique. There's been periods in the history of the discipline in the United States in particular, when groups of architects would kind of consciously excuse themselves from politics, as if architecture could not be political or be apolitical. I think everyone today operates with the assumption that architecture is inherently political, that what we do does make a difference. It intersects with other aspects of policymaking, development, and planning that, of course, have more immediate political affiliations and intersections. And we've seen a growing comfort with the kind of entanglement between design and politics, and people's willingness to kind of put themselves out there and understand that their architecture and their design work is an expression of their political views, and it's a way to manifest those views and share their values with a much larger audience. And I think, again, this is something that is novel as far as conversation goes, simply because these architects are now really having a chance and a responsibility to engage with people beyond an academic environment.
So earning supplemental income and building an identity through an academic position has long been the norm for experimentally oriented critical thinkers and designers, and that remains true for today's emerging practices. But there are other modes of practice like business strategy, community nonprofits, architects working as developers, et cetera, and new venues like gift shops, podcasts, co-ops, that these individuals are exploring that will maybe open up new territory for architects moving into the profession like yourselves. More so than ever, it appears that many architects are exploring alternative manifestations of practice and business to develop projects that are equitable and value-driven. Along with conventional systems, unique financial models of practice that new architecture firms employ today are wide-ranging and quite creative. At the same time, in many new collaborative critical practices in the US, at least one member has an additional job. While certainly labor and schedule intensive, maintaining these other jobs often provides financial stability that offsets riskier decisions and uncompensated research projects and supports employee salaries, rent for office space, and insurance, among other costs of actually running a business. Beyond the financial models that practices are using to sustain themselves, some are also working within and developing new models for how others can access architecture, most of which take the form of co-ownership. Co-op housing, community land trust development projects, and nonprofit community initiatives aim at addressing architecture's economic inaccessibility and find collective labor ownership structures that allow for more people to be involved, ensuring financial viability for architects and clients alike. Efforts to rethink financialization in architecture challenge the status quo and sponsor a future for professional practice that distributes agency and opportunities for wealth creation beyond the privileged constituencies who previously held it in excess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hey, Edgar made it. Hi, Edgar.
Thank you, Kyla and Molly, for sharing and being
You're
here with us
welcome.
today. I think you guys touch on some pretty big topics, like all the hot topics that we kind of shake our heads and try to wrap our brains around. I appreciate that. I think it's really relevant. I had a quick question for you, and then I'll open up the space for anyone else to jump in and ask questions. You guys mentioned kind of like this idea of the client and this financial structure. And I think that this idea of practicing like this is creating opportunity for knowledge, for insight and reflection. But is it hard to prove the value in something less concrete or unconventional? Like, we see the added value in investing in research, but like who foots this bill and how does that translate into practice? Is it always going to be nonprofit work?
That's for you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And that's a question that we also ask in the book. Like, it remains to be seen how that gap will be spanned in a way that creates a sustainable practice over a longer period of time. So what we were interested in doing was trying to find or looking at our peers who are academics and are moving from a more maybe conceptual, experimental, or non-built practice to one that is building things. So they are at this moment of building their practice as a practice of doing buildings, right? So like that movement from something that is more kind of research driven to something that's actually building things in the real world. And for different reasons, Kyle and I were really interested in that moment. I think for Kyle, he is a sort of like more of a curator looking at the overall trends and understanding kind of why architects are doing what they're doing relative to larger cultural systems and things like that. And I'm a practitioner, so I'm interested in like the nuts and bolts of it. Like, how do you pay your employees? How many do you have? Do you rent your office space? What kind of insurance do you have? This kind of stuff. And so I think that as we're looking at that transition and as we're looking at the creative approaches and quite risky in some cases for how young architects in the US are trying to address all of the constraints that they have, like the huge financial burden, the licensure process, like all of these things that make it very, very difficult to start a practice in the US, how they're addressing that, how they're taking risks. And we're trying to basically survey different strategies for how these folks are doing it. And I think your question still remains, and we'll sort of see over time how those different kind of techniques or attempts or whatever really play out for long-term sustainability of a practice, like how well it supports their ongoing efforts at maintaining a sort of critically oriented, experimental, and disciplinary practice in the face of increasing financial pressure. And again, like I said, often working with clients that are whose values really match with their own, often doesn't give you a very big budget, right? Which is why then we're seeing the movement towards materials and construction systems that are trying to leverage things that are really conventional and normative, inexpensive, et cetera, but do really cool things with them, right? So like, I think it was really interesting for us to, we're trying to like pull these individual topics out based on things that were talked about over and over and over in the various different interviews. But of course, they ultimately all kind of connect back to each other. And so they're all sort of reliant on each other or relate back to each other in terms of how these practices are operating in the world today.
Just to add one point to that, you use the word value, and I think that's something that we also find practices striving to demonstrate to people beyond other academics. And there's been longer periods of within the history of architecture where architects didn't have to do that because oftentimes they were working with other wealthy individuals and there was a budget place that allowed them to not have to deal with restrictions and requirements and come up with creative ways to make a project meaningful because there was always a lot more money there. And most of the architects that we revered as students, that you might revere as students, they had it easier, I think, in terms of making a name for themselves. And we're more interested in celebrating the offices that might not have certain affordances and privileges and are really working with developing more unconventional models of practice as a way of not only demonstrating creativity with getting stuff put in the world, but to do so with less means and with a broader audience in mind.
It's a great answer. I think Laura has a question.
Laura, you can't raise your hand.
I can't help myself sometimes.
Go for it.
But I think it's because you brought up this word value, and I was thinking about that as being kind of one of the other categories in this presentation that's probably transversal to all of these issues that you've pointed out. But I think it's such an important topic, not just how architects construct value towards others, towards clients, towards society, but maybe even more importantly, how do they value themselves? Being that the kind of, let's say, the building industry at the end of the day is a huge economic driver. And those of us who practice as architects in construction, at the end of the day, one of the reasons why it's so hard to build a practice is because the value ascribed to the architect as the designer is quite limited. At least that's the way somebody could begin to interpret it, even though our value to society and on so many other fronts is enormous. And so I guess that's all to say that it kind of, I wonder if there were specific conversations that address that issue with your interviewees.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we touched on that, at least indirectly, with most offices. I think one of the challenges is to have the value that we know we all bring to designing and constructing work more immediate to a broader audience. And I think that's also a unique challenge in the United States, where there's not as much inherent cultural weight and value placed upon design. It's very different in other countries, in Europe in particular, where there's a lot more of an investment in arts education and the value of design as an important aspect of society and culture. And so in the United States, which is where development is driven mostly by finance, the things that might have value are maybe cut because they're seen as superfluous. And I think part of what a lot of the offices are trying to do is just claim the value of putting things in the world that are awe-inspiring beyond maybe the practical or tangible value that they have. But it's certainly a challenge, I think, and an uphill battle, like given the lack of investment, even as it pertains to early childhood education in the arts. And when funding is cut, it's often cut from the arts before it gets cut elsewhere. So I think that's part of what a lot of these practices are trying to do is through hard work, declare to others that what they do has value, with the hopes that maybe in the future design fees are higher and there's just more of a demand from the public for design.
I also think that like it seems like with this generation there's less interest in trying to change the existing system, like change how things operate, but more like acknowledge how things operate and be really strategic and creative and do something different. So what we're seeing in some cases is like, you know, we interview a design build office in Los Angeles who started by having a co-op shop that community members bought into, and they would help them make things. And this became actually their way of connecting to the community. And ultimately that's sort of what got their clients that now sustain their business. Or another interview, a practitioner who was like, I'm not going to wait around for this commission that I really want for a single family house. So I'm going to take my entire life savings and put it in this house and just see what happens. This is like a super risky thing to do, right? But like, it's like, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm going to try to do. And other people who are really trying to just work for certain types of organizations, right? And again, the people that we looked at specifically are engaged with academia, which allows for those kind of riskier decisions, because at least there's a baseline of them being able to sustain their own kind of life, you know, pay their rent or their mortgage, you know, et cetera, pay their bills with one level of their job, and then being able to take some of these riskier things. But I think it's really interesting to see, like, not just trying to like be mad at the situation and try to just change how it operates, but actually work around it. Be like, we don't even need to work in that system. We're going to try something really different. And I think what they are then offering are like new financial models, new ways of like, again, not waiting around for a client, but actually working as their own developer, right? And like, I feel like this is a really inspiring kind of way of being, like maybe a more entrepreneurial way of being an architect that, I don't know, it's kind of interesting to see how that plays out. And it is also offering, like another interview is a business strategist who's the current global marketing and business development leader for SOM, like globally. And she has written many kind of articles and essays kind of calling for young architects to kind of organize their business strategy in certain ways to allow for sustainable growth as they build their practice. And so it's interesting kind of looking at all sides of that and looking at the creative choices that young practices are making of how they're getting projects built, how they're like, you know, making risky decisions, who they're choosing to work for and why, how maybe a business plan is like to, you know, break even would be like, you know, some offices like strategies, at least in the early years before they really build, you know, a client base. And I think what we're trying to offer is not like a view, but understanding the kind of atomized like strategies that are kind of that are growing right now, and understanding then maybe over 5, 10, 15 years, kind of how that plays out in terms of building a sustainable practice.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you you mentioned these little projects that are risky attention getters, and they put the foot in the door. I find that that's kind of like the moment of tension where like we have this commentary and this reflective conversation, and then that jump into productive action is really hard. And I find, especially in academia, that it's a risky move, and some people maybe don't even want to make it potentially, or they'll take on really important subjects, and then their action or intervention is maybe underwhelming to the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that to be true as well?
I think it depends on like where they're trying to make a difference. And I had a conversation with a peer the other day about like the limits of operating solely as an academic or a researcher within an academic institution, especially when your research is maybe centered on things that need to manifest in the built environment and be made accessible to a broader audience. But I think I've come around to this. I think the impact that we have is also through the way in which we inspire students to ultimately carry out those values when they move into practice. And so I used to think less of architects that like didn't build, and you know, they were fixtures in academia, but they didn't build. Or they're researchers on policies that affect development and planning, but they themselves aren't operating in the development and planning world in a way that makes a substantive difference. But I think there's also a lot of like under-acknowledged impact that a lot of these architects are making just as being educators, because of the way that they inspire students to ultimately move the dial in practice. And I think that's I imagine this book is primarily for students. So the hope is that like the impact is had in an exponential way through the way that the approach that these architects are taking individually influence other young architects and aspiring architect students to kind of do the same thing. And so for me, it's hard to critique like if one of these practices has only done like one building and they've maybe failed at other attempts, because I think some of the other things that they're doing ultimately might manifest through other people that they inspire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of students, and I know myself, have these really lofty social goals and have nowhere to start. And a lot of people don't want to talk about those questions and how do you deal with clients and how do you deal with the financials. And I think it's a really great place to start opening it up to students.
I totally appreciate that. So when Kyle and I started this project, which we started as a class, as a seminar with students, and these were conversations that, again, for different reasons, we were both having with some of these people when we would run into them at conferences or reviews at other schools or something like that. Exactly those questions that you're talking about. Like, these are the questions that one practitioner to another or one critic to another or whatever could have over a cocktail just when you're hanging out, but you can't really have in this more formal setting. Like, how do you pay your employees? What kind of insurance do you have? Like, how do you make things work? How do you get your clients? Like, those are kind of tricky subjects maybe, but ultimately they're also so kind of critical to discuss and understand. And because the way that those things are operating now and how young offices are kind of managing or negotiating that territory now is really different, I think, than it happened prior, because it really relies on like various different conditions now, like various different legal strategies, the financial situation, the economy, what jobs are available, what clients can afford or what they value, and on and on and on. As well as what we might kind of as a culture value in terms of the way we want to spend our time, right? Who we want to be working for, what kinds of clients or organizations or communities or cities or whatever. And so that's exactly part of the idea here, is to kind of open up what otherwise is sort of unspoken and try to have bigger conversations about this, which hopefully will allow for more of you entering the profession to maybe choose to build your own practice versus simply going to work for someone else, which of course there's value there. And most, if not all, of the practitioners that are part of the interview series worked for other people for a while and then started their offices. And they did so for various different reasons at various different points along their trajectory. But that's really to open that up so you can see that there's really a super wide range of approaches to this. And not only with just going into practice, but also with these people doing other things like graphic design, business strategy, writing, curation of exhibitions, podcasting, and on and on and on.
Absolutely. Edgar, do you want to jump in?
Hi. Yes. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I think my question is like beyond kind of like the publication, which is limited by a number of interviewees and other types of limitations. Do you see this project as something as a pedagogic, like as a larger pedagogical strategy? How do you see this being incorporated into, let's say, traditional architectural education? This knowledge, and by this I mean the knowledge that is being registered or encoded through these series of interviews. Do you see this project evolving into other types of avenues?
I'd like Kyle to mainly answer this because I think this is his like territory of his brain. I just want to start by offering one answer to that, which is that as we got into the course that we sort of taught this initially about, we started thinking of that course as an alternative professional practice. So you all are required to take professional practice. You probably have already taken it, and you learn certain things in that class, but it's usually one semester of your entire architectural education. And you learn a lot of really important things, but it may or may not be directly relevant to your actual experience when you get out into the profession, depending on what kind of firm you work for, what size it is, like the various projects, et cetera, et cetera. So we were imagining this, or we started thinking of this really as like, this is offering other strategies. Like, yes, the nuts and bolts and the kind of little things that wouldn't be talked about in a professional practice, but also if pro-prac is typically like singular in its understanding of what architectural practice is, we were really understanding it as multiple, right? It can be many, many things, and let's try to sort of unpack many of those approaches and many things. So that would be my perspective of that, is really atomizing the idea of what it is to be an architectural practitioner. And that's the first question that we ask every interviewee is, what does it mean to practice architecture, for that exact reason?
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I mean, in reality, the project probably doesn't live more lives in a very direct, intentional way. I think it already lived those lives in the forms that it's taken previously. And in fact, it was first meant to be an exhibition of work produced by 14 of the 32 offices. And as part of preparing for that exhibition, we thought it would be great if we gave students access to those offices to talk about what it's been like for them to start their own practice. And ultimately that part of the project became much more impactful, and something that we continued with. I think differently from other curatorial projects I've been involved with in the past, there was more, I think, of a pedagogical value and potential as it pertained to design. And so it could take more forms just because of its emphasis on visuality. This is really more about conversation starters and uniting a group maybe around certain shared approaches, and also kind of claiming the uniqueness of each of those practices or their differences. So yeah, I mean, I think we hope that the book continues to have an impact, and it's a conversation starter, and we imagine other people picking up those conversations, in particular in ways of rethinking the professional practice course. I know a lot of schools are really thinking about different models for those classes. Some of them are moving towards like a kind of module-based structure where different practitioners come in and teach different modules. We can't really dismiss the stuff that's taught in that class because the vast majority of students enter conventional practice settings, and they need to have familiarity with the traditional procedures of practice, if only for the fact that they can strive to evolve them and overcome some of the challenges. But it's not necessarily a replacement for that class, but something that we think of as pivotal, and not even complementary, but as something that should be part of that class as an extension. So it's kind of, I mean, Molly mentioned this earlier, I think, but all of that stuff is required to be taught in one semester, and it's the vast majority of what you encounter as a practitioner. And so I like the idea that, you know, there might be a series of classes that more directly engage with professional practice, as opposed to relegating it to a kind of banal required course that's oftentimes not very invigorating.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I mean, yeah, I think there is something very interesting that I see a lot more potential in, like seeing this, or like the course that you both gave as a seminar, almost like integrating it more into a curriculum of like an imagined architecture school or architecture education, where as a student, you're exposed to these, I don't know, like opportunities in more depth, or integrating them as just part of what an architect does and not as an alternative. Yeah, I don't know, like it just made me think of how that would impact like the curriculum of like a 5-year program, for example. And yeah, I don't know, it's exciting to think of the possibilities.
Yeah, I was just talking to Evie, the director of Syracuse Architecture's New York City program, and we were talking about how an already existing component of that curriculum, which is an internship that's both paid and credited, can be complemented by a class that contextualizes a lot of the practices that those students go and work for. So we're really together kind of rethinking the identity of one aspect of our curriculum, which is when students have a chance to study in New York City, as something where that's really meaningfully engaged with, and where students are kind of in real time exposed to practices that are probably more conventional, but also learning about ways in which those conventions in that context can be challenged.
Yeah, amazing.
Edgar, you could have just come downstairs to ask us that question.
I'm not at the school.
No. Can we ask you guys a question?
Sure, go ahead. I was going to.
How'd we do? No, I mean, like, I don't know how many of you would have read the introduction, but it probably would have been hard to follow if you hadn't, given that that intro starts to set the context for some of those practices, but also just in terms of highlighting what we found to be common points of intersection. The point was already made that those are the kind of hot topics. But yeah, just curious to know if that way of understanding these practices was valuable to the students and useful, even just from a practical standpoint, like throwing those quotes up there, which we think provide additional context and specificity, but might be hard to follow while we're speaking.
Maybe somebody from the class should answer that.
Yeah.
Don't be shy.
Well, I can bridge that gap until one of our students jumps in, because
Yeah,
I also.
Chris is typing in the chat, so we saw some of his comments.
Oh, Chris, you want to jump in?
I was making the
Sure.
case to Molly that we all have the ability to kind of multitask now and listen and read at the same time.
I completely disagreed, with all due respect. I couldn't read the quotes because some of them were so big. And
Yeah.
I really was engaged and really wanted to listen to you. So after, in all honesty, after about like slide 7, I stopped reading the quotes because I actually wanted to listen to you.
Yeah.
So the thing I wrote in the comments was, if you could just, okay, and just pause it before changing every slide, just to make sure that everyone can read it, would be my only feedback. Besides that, I thought it went great. It's just, now I'll have to download it and then read it after, so.
Yeah,
Sure.
and you're allowed to.
Yeah.
No, I think we thought about like cutting the quotes. And like just excerpting something that was maybe the most specific, but I think what we wanted to do was also just share the different components that make the book up and presence the very specific approaches that individual people have and share their work, of course. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the quotes were great. It was just, I can't multitask, so it's my issue.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Chris. I guess what you both were asking about was, through the readings, if our students thought that, the discussion that we're having in class kind of throughout these weeks resonates or overlaps with the introduction to your book. I can maybe speak for someone who, I don't know exactly where I am. I guess I am at the end of the generation of architects that are part of the interviews, and in between, this generation of students that are just about to graduate. So I wouldn't say like I am a younger architect, or I'm because
you still called us young and emerging.
Well, fun fact, I graduated in 2015, so I guess I would be within the bracket of people that you were looking at, which I believe graduated 8 years before and after the crisis of 2008, right? More or less, I think. But I would say for Laura and I, and for a lot of the people in kind of like our generation, this completely resonates with how we work and also how we teach. And I love this idea that you were also talking about today, of the kind of getting rid of the anxiety, if that makes sense. Through not being kind of like a prey of the digital tools or of being an architect with a capital A. And through this kind of like crisis moment, being able to say, well, I'm going to work.
There we go.
with,
You're back
sorry. Oh, was I gone?
For a minute.
for a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I was
You
just saying.
cut out after the part about losing the anxiety.
Okay, perfect.
Being brave.
Yeah, you know, of using digital tools or of form or of being an architect with a capital A and, you know, working more in like a DIY, unconstrained way. And, you know, most of the questions that I had were also about, and I still have them, how can, you know, this approach to practice after school be part of the discourse when we go back to school as professors or as lecturers? I think classes like the one you led or like this one provide a platform at least to also, you know, I guess bridge the gap or, you know, reconcile practice and academia. And that's I guess my kind of comment or my feedback to the reading. So it's still super relevant today. And I think that was one of the goals of the book, right? That these questions keep on appearing. And speaking of the questions, you know, I love that you're posing so many questions. And it's sad that a lot of them are still unsolved, right? For all of us, just because they're so difficult and so entangled. So I don't know if it's not too difficult of a thing to ask, what would be, you know, for you two as two architects that belong to this generation that you were interviewing, one question or, you know, one important aspect of practicing or of teaching that you could resolve through, you know, through putting together this amazing book, or what does it mean to practice architecture to you?
You want to go first?
Sure. I'm not going to answer your question exactly, Pablo, but I wanted to talk about what does it mean to practice architecture. The thing that was the most impactful to me in the kind of wide-ranging answers that we got to that question was really the idea that practice is a kind of ongoing, constant thing. So there could be no resolve until like we die and it's over, right? Because the way that architecture is practiced is it's practiced, like it's over and over and over, and things unfold and you're testing different things in each project. And so I actually find the lack of resolution to be really like sort of a positive thing, like a thing of we'll see over time. Like this is, you know, we're surveying all of these people who are just at the beginnings of building their practice through buildings, like they're just starting to build their first buildings or do their first major projects or get their first big like business strategy job or whatever it is. And it's the beginning of that long practice that we'll really see if this is the moment kind of sociopolitically, environmentally, et cetera, that we're starting in, how some of those approaches will really unfold over time. And so to me, the idea of practicing architecture as something that is practiced over time really is like encouraging. It's an exciting way of thinking about architecture is, yeah, lack of being able to resolve any of these things, but as kind of constantly testing and operating and attempting. And so I like that definition quite a lot.
I'm glad I had the last minute to think about this. One of the things that I like that has happened is that I think we've broken the cycle of novelty chasing that has happened in academia for the last 30 years. I think especially given the introduction of all things digital. And I think like claiming that last piece of unclaimed novel aesthetic territory seems to have like finally exhausted itself. But the result of that is we've become increasingly less accessible to the public and have had more anxiety about gaining influence in elite academic circles and less anxiety about actually practicing in a way that further demonstrates the value of design. And so for me, the big question is, like, now that we've dug ourselves this hole after a sustained period of novelty chasing, like, how do we reconnect with a broader audience to simultaneously proclaim the value of what we do to one another, but also to the to a broader group of people. And I think one of the things that I don't practice, I don't intend to, again, but I see one of the things I see my peers struggling with is like having to produce different sets of documents, like one that will appeal to other academics and be immediately recognizable as like an intellectual endeavor, and then having to change the narrative and the representation to make an appeal to those not trained in architecture. And I would love for that gap to be closed. And I think the hope is that like by having these conversations that put students and practitioners in the room, that a little bit of that academic practice divide is bridged, but I think another bridge needs to be constructed between like the intellectual aspects of architecture and then like the more tangible value that others might find in it. That those two things don't have to be exclusive.
Thank you. I can tell you which one is out of all of these questions, and I love to constantly ask these questions, is the one that for me is unresolved, and I don't have an answer, and it's just like such a difficult question, but we keep trying to, you know, pose the question. For me, is you just said it in a way, Kyle, a second ago. How can the intellectual rigor of research-oriented approaches to practice be maintained when architecture is provided as a service, right? For example, I think this is a super difficult question, and maybe, you know, maybe it needs to be addressed more in academia, or, you know, I don't know. I don't have an answer to this, but that's a super important kind of central question for me, that to our generation, and I'm sure for the coming generation of architects, is going to still be central, and I hope we still kind of keep on finding an answer for that.
Yeah, I think one of the things we tried to do is privilege the questions that we think are beneficial to try to answer. And we acknowledge that, you know, we could only ask so many questions in the time that we had with those architects, and they didn't always have the answers, and nor was that the goal. But I think the goal is to start to ask questions that we think are going to be helpful to acknowledge as things that don't yet have answers. So that's what we were saying earlier. Like this is really as much of a reveal of conversations as it is a conversation starter. Now that it can be made, that those interviews can be made accessible to other people.
So, I think it's really interesting, kind of as a reflection from the introduction that you guys wrote in the book. And by the way, Chris, you should kind of just raise your hand and give your question if you want. But I think that it's super interesting, the introduction, and how you both explain the kind of conditions that produce that generation of architects that is in on the pages of your book, and how it's about technology and politics and of course economics, and that there's this kind of like a series of moments that have kind of shaped a generation, that resonates a lot with me, having seen somehow been the kind of impacted and seen how that impacts other practitioners and academics who are maybe even a few years ahead, and how that has shaped certain things like paper architecture, and in general, like American academia. And so I guess one of the kind of principal motivators or questions for us in the seminar, in regards to our students, is to identify what the set of conditions might be for their generation that would, you know, if somebody would write a book about them in 10 years from now, what would those kind of, what would the scenario be described as that produces a certain kind of work? And so that's not so much a question for Kyle and Molly as it is for our students. I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Do you guys think of yourselves as being impacted by a different set of circumstances and conditions than the ones that we detailed for this group, or do you see some overlap?
I think at least for me, I absolutely see some overlap. This idea of alternative professional practice and just having options, and you get out of school and you're so creative and excited and are slapped with traditional professional practice, and it's can be really confining. And so these alternatives that you're proposing, I think, is super interesting. And more so like just more motivating to try something new.
Yeah, I think part of them, like part of the formation of these alternative approaches were also born out of necessity. Like I think a lot of practices and a lot of our peers were deeply impacted by social and racial unrest and the kind of climate crisis that they couldn't imagine maintaining an affiliation to conventional forms of practice, which are oftentimes complicit in exacerbating some of those things. And so it's been really interesting to see how our peers have evolved or not in the past 5 to 10 years. And it really immediately conveys their values relative to how they do or do not evolve. Certain things are just unavoidable to be impacted by, but there are other things that you can kind of choose, or maybe you're not so susceptible to things like a financial crisis. And for you guys, it'll be different. I think like there's, obviously it's on everybody's minds now, but the role of artificial intelligence and automation and the role, like the kind of labor of the architect will evolve radically in the next years in unknowing ways. And I also think exaggerated challenges with issues of diversity and equity, especially as it pertains to higher education, given that affirmative action is likely to be overturned in June. And I think like those challenges will continue to grow and will, again, deeply impact how things like architectural practice is altered.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who has any more comments or questions for Kyle and Molly?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think the self-censorship that students exhibit so often is because they don't feel like they're even qualified to talk about these issues. Like when students have to write a thesis, a lot of people don't even want to say anything because they feel like, hey, I'm just 23 years old. What do I have to say, for example?
Yeah, I mean, and part of it is, I mean, I talk to my students all the time, and all of our students now in my role of like the way in which they need to feel empowered to speak up, to make change, because all of you have very different lived experiences that we do, and your positions, opinions are sometimes more needed than us talking to each other and maintaining the status quo. But I totally understand that anxiety, just given power dynamics and, you know, the process of gaining confidence in oneself. And yes, I would love to do a 5-year update. I mean, actually, that was one of the things I thought about as being like really, really meaningful. Like, I think Molly feels this way too. Like, I believe that some of the people we've interviewed will become among the most important architects, activists, designers, critics, curated in the world. And I think to have this as something to look back upon will be really revealing and useful. I was a part of another project called Possible Mediums that a lot of these people were a part of. And at that time, it was more about their work than them. But for me, this is something I imagine participating in continuously, like taking stock, basically, and trying to say something on behalf of my peers, given that I've excused myself from practice and I'm letting everybody else do the dirty work.
Well, me and Edgar will buy a copy, so at least you got two sold.
Awesome.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you so much for coming and sharing your work. I know at least I'm very excited. I have so many things to think about now. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
you.
I think you guys probably recognize how lucky you are to have this class, and it's really great that Pablo and Laura are organizing it. Don't get too comfortable because I'm trying to steal them back to join us in Syracuse next year.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That was great and a great discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much, Molly and Kyle.
And thanks
welcome.
everyone who joined. Thanks everyone in the
Thanks, Edgar.